Jesus the Utopian. I think Jesus was a utopian in the sense that he was not realistic. He believed that God will take care of things. For example, he tells the people in front of him, "You're of much more worth than the birds, and God feeds the birds, so don't worry, God will feed you." Yep. But God does not feed the birds. He feeds 50% of them, the other 50% die. Again, you're being literal, you're being scientific. He's not a scientist, he's a storyteller. But the point of his story is incorrect. Of course it is, and everybody knows that. Look at the lilies of the field. They're beautiful, but of course some of them are ugly or dead. Everybody knows that. He's not making a scientific statement. He's painting a poetic picture. But the advice is wrong, telling them not to worry. God will take care of you. Look up the word food in a concordance, and it can have a spiritual meaning. He's talking about literal food here. Is he? Let's take a look at it. Okay, it is literal. Food, drink, clothes. He's telling them not to worry about their physical needs. Okay, so what? His advice is maybe you're starving to death, but don't worry about it. Everybody dies anyway? Yes. Well, that's a stupid point. No, it isn't. If that's all he says, it's stupid, but here's what he means by food. John 4. No, wait. That's not fair. Maybe that's what he means in John 4, but that's not what he means here. Yeah, I think you mentioned that at one point about the apostles not understanding that real food is spiritual food, but here he's not talking about spiritual food. Okay, he's talking about literal food and saying don't worry about it. What's his real point? What should you worry about? Spiritual food. But what does he say after that? Okay, he says, do not worry and say, what are we to eat? What are we to drink, or what are we to wear? Your heavenly Father knows that you need them all, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Okay, your point, the spiritual food. And all these things will be given you besides. That's the literal food he's promising. You'll be given what you need. But some people starve. Yes, but literal food is not what they really need. They need spiritual food. They need to die and come to heaven. Oh, geez, if you meant that, I think people would say, what? I say we do need to plan for our food and worry about how we're going to get it. You think Jesus is denying that? You really think he's a 60s hippie? Yes, exactly. I think he's a utopian. He's saying, don't worry about this, don't worry about that. God will take care of you. But birds die of starvation. People die of starvation. People do die of starvation, but what is more important, literal or spiritual food? I don't argue with that, but my point is that Jesus naively assumes that God feeds the birds, and well, God doesn't feed the birds. God gives them what they need as birds. No, he doesn't. He lets them die. Here's a quote from the Encyclopedia Americana. The first year is the most difficult one in the life of a bird. In most species, the mortality rate for young birds during the first year is about 50%, but in some species it may reach as high as 80% to 90%. That's from the Encyclopedia Americana. New Scientist, quote, 1/3 of adult birds and 4/5 of their offspring die of starvation every year. In general, he feeds the birds. And you're saying Jesus' point was not to worry, even if you end up starving, you'll be fine eventually spiritually in heaven. Yes, exactly. Like all the saints and martyrs. Like Socrates. Death was not a big deal. I don't think Jesus' advice would be very edifying for starving Somalians. Well, maybe that's evidence that our spiritual wisdom is not where it should be. Okay, here's another example of Jesus being a utopian, being unrealistic. He tells people to forgive 70 times 7 times. That's a way of expressing a general principle. If you interpret that literally, then after you've forgiven 49 times, you take revenge the 50th time. He meant forgiveness is not something you measure out mathematically. I think realistically, once a person says he's sorry 3 times and still does it the 4th time, you shouldn't forgive that person. Oh, really? How many times have people been selfish and lazy? More than 49, I guarantee you. Should they no longer expect forgiveness after 49 times? Okay, that's in general, but for a specific offense, like if I steal from my grandmother and I say, oh, I'm sorry, then I do it again, and I say, oh, I'm sorry, and then I do it again. If it's calculated, then you're not really sorry. Well, right, that's exactly my point. Doesn't it make forgiveness meaningless if you forgive the person for the same thing again and again? If a kid steals from his grandmother 49 times, I think she should say, no, I don't forgive you. You're not really sorry because you keep doing it. Now, I agree that if a person is sincerely sorry, sincerely repents, even a very heinous crime, you should forgive that person. But I have trouble with forgiving 49 times for the same thing, because that's prime evidence that the person has not sincerely repented. Really? Are you married? No. Well, if you were, you would know that husbands and wives hurt each other constantly, even though they love each other. Time and time again, they're insensitive to each other's feelings, and they fight, and then they say, I'm sorry. Should they not forgive each other? All right. But that's a different kind of thing. I'm talking about stealing from somebody, for example, or drunk driving. I would not forgive a drunk driver 49 times. Actually, it's not 49 times. It's 70 times 7 times, which is 490 times, which means virtually no limit. And I say that's bad advice. You're just, enabling the person to continue to sin. Obviously, the person's not sincere once you get past 3 or 4 times. I think Jesus was assuming that the person is sincere. Well, how can a person be sincerely sorry and do it again 490 times? Oh, come on, you've never goofed 490 times? We're not talking about goofing, we're talking about sin. How many times do husbands and wives go back and forth and have to say, I'm sorry? Okay, but Peter was married, and he knew that. He didn't have to ask Jesus about that. I'm sure he knew that in a relationship, in a marriage, there's going to be a certain amount of rifts and foibles and whatever. He's talking about a sin. So like if he hits me, if he steals from me, if he lies to me. Notice what you're doing. You're criticizing Jesus for being too namby-pamby about forgiveness, yet for being too tough on the issue of hell. Yes, exactly. I am. I think he's a religious extremist. He's going too far in both directions, which is a good definition of a religious extremist. All right, Jesus as a utopian. Another example. He says to give your cloak to anyone who asks for your cloak and to give freely to beggars. You're interpreting it literally again, like a fundamentalist. He's deliberately using exaggerated examples to make the point. You can convert people's hearts only if you act in a countercultural way. There's a preacher in New York City who worked with gangs, tough gangs, and one day he decided to let one of the gang members, a thief, hold on to the church's money. And that blew the young man's mind. He's showing such trust in me, allowing me to hang on to this money till the banks open the next day. And that started him on the road to conversion. No, I've always understood that. You can change people by being unexpectedly kind to them. That is a great spiritual insight of Jesus's. But there are limits. You're not going to change Hitler by being nice to him. And that's where I think Jesus failed in his teachings. He didn't bother with any qualifications. My conviction is that Jesus constantly said things for the sake of impact at the expense of accuracy. That's right. And the result has been those sayings are still alive and still transform society. So Jesus exaggerated in order to make the point more strongly. Yeah. All right. Okay. Not bad. I don't object to Jesus teaching lofty ideals, but I think instead of saying turn the other cheek, you should have said turn the other cheek sometimes, or most times, or initially. Qualify it in some way. But he just flat out states it categorically. Well, if Jesus was a man of common sense, he would never say, turn your cheek all the time, or give to people even when they are known thieves. What about somebody you know who's going to take that money and just buy drugs? Of course you don't give it to them. All right, so all this is understood. You're taking it too literally. By literally, you don't mean literally versus figuratively, but literally in the sense of every time. Exactly. Yeah. I remember talking to a minister years ago, and we talked about the same issue. And as I walked into the church, there was a guy there asking for money. And I said, well, did you give him money, like Jesus said to? And he said, no, because I know the guy, and he's going to use it for drugs, so I'm not going to give him money. Sometimes I'll give a homeless bum a couple bucks. I never give him enough to buy drugs, but maybe he'll buy some food. I had an interesting experience in Boston many years ago. I was at the bus station, and a guy came up to me with a nice sports jacket on, and he seemed pretty civil, and he said he happened to be short on his money. He just needs another couple of dollars to buy his bus ticket. And he seems very sincere, and he was nicely dressed. Didn't look like a wino, so I said, okay, here. Then about 10 years later, I was at the same bus station, and the same guy comes up to me, looking a little bit more like a wino this time, with the same story, the same shtick. And I said, oh no, I remember you. I'm not going to give you anything.
I would frequently see a very dirty woman by Penn Station in New York, and I never gave her anything. But one day she looked pretty miserable, even more miserable than usual, and she was kind of mumbling, and she had the tin cup. And I stopped and I thought to myself, maybe I should give her something. And a cop came up to me and said, "Don't give her any money. That's Martha. She goes to Florida every year."
Okay, I want to clarify something. I don't want you to think that when Jesus said you can move a mountain, that I have always interpreted that as a literal mountain. Most of my life, I did not think it was a literal mountain. I naturally interpreted it, like most people do, as a figurative mountain, obviously.
So you're not a fundamentalist then?
Right, but then once I was no longer a Christian, I read it more carefully, more objectively, and I said, no, wait, this is literal, because the context is literal. Jesus just made a fig tree wither, a literal miracle. The apostles were amazed. He said, you yourselves can do as much with a small grain of faith.
Was Jesus in the business of showing us how to move a mountain, how to control the physical world?
No, but he's teaching the power of faith here.
That if you have faith, you can move a mountain without expending money and effort?
Right, and you can't do that.
Of course you can, so that interpretation is ridiculous.
No, what Jesus said is ridiculous. He's overstating. He's a religious extremist. This is what I always find in Christian hermeneutics. It's always, how do we make sense of this? It's never, does this make sense? You are a priori not allowed to come up with a verdict of nonsense. Like you're saying, a literal understanding here is ridiculous, so therefore that can't be the right interpretation, despite the evidence and context that shows that it is literal. So let me back that up. Peter the Apostle walking on water. He's walking on water until he loses faith, and then he starts to sink. That's not symbolic. That's literal.
That's right. That's not a parable.
Jesus says you can do that with faith.
That's right.
But you can't. Nobody can walk on water.
If you have enough faith, then you can.
So you can rise to the ceiling right now?
If I had enough faith, I don't.
You don't have enough faith. You know what? I can fly by flapping my arms, except when people watch me. As long as you watch me, I can't do it. You're just making excuses.
Well, if by faith you simply mean belief that you can do it, of course not. Crazy people believe that they can do all sorts of things, but they can't. But if by faith you mean a relationship with God that is so strong that God's power comes into you, yes, you can do miracles. Because you will let yourself be the instrument of God to do a miracle. And many of the saints have done miracles like that. Like flying through the air, St. Joseph of Cupertino.
Oh, see, I just don't believe that. You believe it. We agree to disagree here.
If there is a God, there can be miracles. Why not?
Yeah, can be, but my experience, there aren't. Belief over behavior. One of the main reasons I reject Jesus is that he emphasized belief over behavior. I think good behavior is much more important than correct belief. In fact, I think the proper way to worship God is simply to behave well. And I don't think God cares that much if you believe in him. But in the Bible, it's believe, believe, believe. Mark 16:16. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned.
Jesus taught faith, not belief. And faith is more than just intellectual assent. What does it mean to believe in Jesus? It means to believe in that which Jesus is, namely love. Gandhi didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but he believed in the character of Jesus. He believed in unselfish love, and that's what Jesus was.
Yeah, but Jesus never said, you don't have to believe in me or my theology, you just have to be a good person. He never said that. He basically said the opposite. In John 3:18, Jesus says, he who does not believe is condemned because he hasn't believed.
That's right.
So that's what's important, the belief in Jesus. Biblically, the difference between heaven and hell is belief rather than behavior. So according to that scripture, I'm going to hell, my atheist friends are going to hell.
Does the Eskimo know Jesus? No. But insofar as he seeks the truth, he is seeking God. That has always been the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church, that people who seek the truth are Christians because they sought the truth, and the truth is God, even though they didn't know that. The key is being committed to love and truth.
Okay, but isn't that essentially the liberal Christian position, that being a good person, rather than any kind of intellectual assent, that's what God wants?
Okay, yeah, I'm a liberal on that issue. It's your heart that gets you to heaven, not your intellectual position. I interpret believe in a very broad sense. Granted, many people interpret it in a narrow sense of intellectual assent. If you don't have orthodox theology, you're going to hell. I think they're wrong.
Slavery. I can't accept a religion that does not speak out against slavery.
There was a gradual development in the realization that slavery was intrinsically wrong.
But if you believe in eternal values, why are God's values being compromised?
Well, that's an easy question to answer because we humans are very dumb and it takes us a long time to see these things, these eternal values. Why didn't God correct us on slavery right away? Because he wants us to learn ourselves so that we'll never forget. He doesn't want to do the work for us. I think farmers would understand my point because they know that things take time to grow.
Okay, I agree, it takes time, but it's going to take even longer if you don't enunciate the correct principle in the first place. The Bible is supposed to teach us morality. Who in the Bible abolished slavery? Nobody.
Yeah, right. But implicitly they did. In Philemon, in the New Testament, Paul says to the slave owner, free your slave.
No, he doesn't.
Yes, he does. He says, treat him as a brother. That means he's not a slave anymore.
It should mean that, but Paul didn't get that.
Of course it meant that.
No, he didn't say free him. He said only treat him as a brother, but you can't treat him as a brother unless you free him.
Of course that means you free him.
Oh, you're reading that in. That's not in the text.
All right, I agree that Paul didn't explicitly say slavery is intrinsically immoral, therefore all Christians should free their slaves.
Right. He expressly said, obey your masters.
And he said to slave masters, treat your slaves as you would treat Christ. He didn't say free them, so he was not fully enlightened, but he was a step in the right direction. Like Muhammad saying you can't have as many wives as you want, you can only have 4. Well, that's not the ideal. You're supposed to have only 1, but it's progress.
And all over, Mama, we know that your spirit is there. No, I can't forget the hour with the dearest one, Mom, and sweeter than the flowers. No, there's no need to bow. Oh, no, Mama, we'll never forget you, and someday we'll meet you up there.
The progressive revelation defense. You think there's a lot of bad stuff in the Old Testament because mankind was at a primitive stage.
Yes, you see a gradual evolvement of morality.
Okay, but I find in certain instances, just when it would be a perfect time to enlighten primitive man, the biblical God just confirms the old morality. Like the Hebrews understood what indentured servitude was, so why not at that point tell them indentured servitude is okay, but slavery no more referring to people as property.
That was the best they could do. I think you have a more optimistic view of human nature than I do.
Well, I have a higher expectation of God. He should put out the ideals to shoot for, even if they're not quite ready, instead of accommodating his laws to the culture.
He did. The ideal of marriage, 1 man, 1 woman, was expressed fairly early.
Yeah, okay, in that case, but he's certainly sending out mixed messages if his man, David, had many wives and concubines. One of your main defenses of the Old Testament, or of Christianity in general, is, I'll call it the primitive man defense, that man was not quite ready to be more morally enlightened at the time. I'll call it the progressive revelation. That would be a good term for it, right?
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that's not only a key defense you have, but a huge, all-encompassing one, because you can apply it to almost anything.
Right.
And I think progressive revelation is not a legitimate defense of the immoralities in the Bible. I think the picking up sticks passage shows that. A guy is picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and the Hebrews aren't sure what the punishment should be. They ask God, and God tells them, stone the guy to death. So your contention is that God gave harsh laws because that's all they could understand at that stage. But here, they weren't sure what to do, and it was a perfect opportunity to advance them, and he doesn't.
Jesus did enlighten them years later when they were ready, telling them that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But what would have been the result if God had enlightened them here too early? What would have been the reaction? They would have said, oh, the Sabbath laws don't count anymore.
No, it would have been that the Sabbath laws are important, but you don't kill somebody for violating it. Because they said, well, we don't know what to do. I'll tell you, says God, kill him. In fact, kill him brutally with stones. I'm supposed to believe in a God like that?
This is just an extreme example of the principle of progressive revelation. These people are so primitive that that's what they needed at the time.
Even though they were ready to move on and get a little more civilized?
People are stupid. People are slow. It's a long learning process.
Oh, I disagree. Here's one of my other points. They've done experiments with monkeys. Subhumans, monkeys. And these monkeys would get food if they pressed a buzzer, but at the same time their companions in the next cell would get an electric shock if they pressed the buzzer. Seeing what happened, they were very reluctant to press the buzzer for food, and one monkey went 2 weeks without eating rather than shock his friends. Monkeys are capable of compassion. Why are humans so incapable of compassion that they'd be willing to stone a man to death for picking up sticks?
Well, the tougher primitive people are, the tougher you have to be.
So you think it was necessary for people to stone somebody to death for picking up sticks for firewood or whatever?
If that passage is to be taken literally, then my answer has to be yes, because God doesn't make mistakes.
Okay, well, my answer is I'm going to believe in a different God, a more compassionate God.
If you don't mind, let's not discuss the ridiculous laws in the Old Testament that God supposedly imposed on his people. We're not going to get anywhere.
Okay, but the overall argument, the progressive revelation argument, that I think is a key thing.
All right.
Say there's a car company and they make millions of cars, and it turns out these cars have a brake defect in a certain model. When you go over 60 miles an hour and it's rainy, the brakes don't work. 600,000 people have been killed already. And finally people take this car company to court. They accuse them of this crime. And their defense is, well, we were going to let you know, but we didn't get around to it. Wouldn't you, as a jury member, find them guilty?
Absolutely.
All right, well, this car company's name is Christianity. The model of the car is slavery, and Jesus is the president of the company.
Christianity doesn't claim to be a political system. It doesn't claim to have all the answers for an ideal world. It claims to make your soul good and to get you to heaven.
It claims to teach proper morality.
Yeah, but proper morality from a Christian perspective is not so much how to treat other people, but how to know God, how to get to heaven. On slavery, Christianity had been ahead of other religions, although I agree it should have been further ahead than it was.
But shouldn't Christianity's ultimate representative, Jesus, have said something? I mean, a key thing, I just thought of this morning. If you're going to use the progressive revelation defense, then progressive revelation absolutely implies further revelation. Right, but there was none. Jesus did not speak out against slavery.
He didn't need to. Jesus was talking to the Jews only. The Jews didn't have slaves. They had indentured servants.
They had slaves.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they did.
It's very clear in Jewish theology, people are not property.
It's very clear they are property. Leviticus 25, it calls slaves property. That whole section is about your Jewish slaves. Treat them nicely. But from the other countries around you, you can take slaves, and they belong to you forever, and they're property.
Okay, that's slaves taken in war who deserve to die.
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say war. It says you can buy them. It refers to them as property, and you can beat them. You cannot beat servants. You can only beat slaves.
Okay, the difference between Jewish morality and New Testament morality is not that clear. There were compromises, you're right, but by the time you get to Jesus' day, they didn't have slaves in Israel.
But Paul was telling them to obey their masters.
In Rome, not in Israel.
Wait a minute, you're confusing me. Paul is telling people to obey their masters. What difference does it make if they're Roman or Jewish? He's telling them to obey their masters.
Because in Roman law, slaves are property, and Romans had slaves.
And he was supporting that, and he's God's representative in the Bible. Big spokesman, Paul.
Wasn't supporting slavery. In fact, he was enunciating principles that would later blossom into anti-slavery.
But it's not there in the Bible. That's the problem with the whole progressive revelation defense here. Later never came.
Politically, Jesus didn't explicitly say free the slaves, but he obviously opposed slavery.
Well, I don't agree with you that he obviously opposed slavery. He used parables including slaves, and the slave masters in the parables weren't doing anything wrong.
Jesus taught a radical morality. to love everybody, to love even your enemies. A human person is sacred. That is why slavery is wrong. Does that not follow logically?
Yeah, that follows logically as a general principle, yes, but I think Jesus missed the boat on slavery. On progressive revelation, I have a comparative example, the Mormons. They did not allow blacks to become priests until 1978.
Yeah.
So I talked to a Mormon some years ago, and I brought that issue up, and he said, well, we allow them now, implying, so what's the problem? Well, that's basically the progressive revelation defense that, well, we might have been wrong then, but we got it right now. My conviction is that you can't be wrong about something so important at any time and be regarded as a true religion.
The church has never ever taught that slavery is just.
The church. How about this passage and progressive revelation, Deuteronomy 13:6-10. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your daughter...
I'm not going to respond to that. You can find a lot of garbage in the Old Testament, and we've gone through that already. It's not going to get us any further.
But here, this passage, people naturally, even if they're primitive, don't want to kill their relatives or their loved ones. But God is telling them to do that. So God is not giving them only what they can handle. He's pushing them right back into barbarism.
I can't answer for the social situation of the time. It does come across as ridiculous.
It does, and it says, do not add to what I have commanded or subtract, but keep the commandments of the Lord. So this is not a provisional law.
I guarantee you I'm not going to have a new satisfying answer to those kinds of questions.
And therefore you're wrong, right?
No, we're just not going to get anywhere.
All right, we agree to disagree on this.
Little kids throw stones at the prophet Elijah, and he asks God to have a bear come and kill them.
Right.
And the children are killed by the bear. Who knows what the hell's going on there?
I do.
No, you don't.
Yes, I do. That's people talking, making up stories. That's not God.
Maybe so. I'm not a fundamentalist. Not every passage is God's infallible word.
C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis's trilemma that Jesus was either liar, lunatic, or Lord, I don't agree with that.
Why?
Because I think there's other possibilities. A fourth possibility to me is that Jesus was a religious extremist who was wrong.
Okay, name another religious extremist who's not a liar or a lunatic, but who claimed to be God.
First person that comes to mind is Muhammad. He didn't claim to be God, but he claimed to be getting his information from God. And he wasn't a lunatic personality, and he probably wasn't a liar. He believed what he said. So wasn't he likewise that fourth category, a religious extremist?
Yeah, he was kind of a religious extremist, but he didn't claim to be God. He just claimed to be a prophet. If Jesus was a religious extremist but not God, he's either insane if he really thinks he's God, or he's a deliberate liar if he knows he's not.
He couldn't just be wrong, an extremist who's wrong? Does the person who thinks he's God have to be insane? Well, if you force me to say it, I'll say he was insane. But I prefer the label of religious extremist because he wasn't a lunatic personality or an egotist, and he did teach some good things.
What have you read of C.S. Lewis, by the way?
I've read Mere Christianity and one or two others along the way, the Screwtape Letters. I mean, I think he's very good, but I think he's wrong. For example, he interprets hell as a gloomy place that people freely choose to be in. Is that roughly what?
Yeah.
I say he can't do that because Jesus had different imagery, fire and furnace and flames. So he can't just ignore the imagery that Jesus uses.
Well, that's an image, and fire is scary, and hell is scary, so it's an effective image.
Yeah, but fire is an image of serious suffering compared to just isolation or gloominess.
Lewis was close to an annihilationist.
But Revelation 14:11 says, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they shall have no rest day or night. Doesn't that suggest sentient beings suffering forever?
It suggests that, yeah.
prayer. I read your assessment of Jesus' promise of answered prayers, and you say the key in understanding that is that it's a matter of time, that prayers are eventually answered not in our time, but in God's time. Yes. To me, that's not a legitimate interpretation, because people are not praying that their child eventually ends up in heaven. They're praying that their child not die now, or not suffer from a disease now, and those prayers are not answered. Well, the answer to those prayers is no. But the answer is also that I've got something better for you. If you think my not letting this child die now is a good plan, you're wrong. I have a better plan. I know more than you do. But Jesus doesn't say eventually I will answer your prayers. He doesn't say eventually your sick child will end up in heaven. He says I will grant you your prayers, which is not true. He doesn't say when. Well, let's say your child is under the rubble of a building in an earthquake. I don't want my child to suffer for 10 days before he dies, but he's going to, and he does. My prayers are not granted. That's right, but there's no suffering in heaven. But the point is, the prayer wasn't answered the way Jesus promised. Not immediately or for the next couple of days, but for the whole of eternity, yes. And suppose God did answer all prayers and did miracles all over the place. Okay, that's a bigger question, but I'm focusing on what Jesus said, that your prayers will be granted. See, Jesus to me is an extremist, a utopian. Okay, I am interpreting Jesus' promise in an eschatological way rather than an immediate way. Suppose Jesus meant that God would answer our prayers immediately in this world. What would be the result? Have you read Brave New World? Yeah. That's what you would have. No pain, no suffering, no problems, but no great literature, no heroes. Everybody's happy, but there's no Shakespeare, there's no Beethoven. Is that what you want? Okay, but that's a bigger question. I'm trying to focus on Jesus' promise of answered prayer. And I'm claiming that that's an overstatement of a religious extremist. Do you pray? Yes and no. I do a lot of thinking and contemplating, if you want to call that prayer. But I don't do petitionary prayer because I don't think it's answered. Why not? Personal experience, for one, and in 2006, a big test was done called the STEP experiment, and so it was a big study on intercessory prayer with 1,800 heart patients, and the results showed there was no effect by prayer on the health of the people prayed for. A double-blind test? Yeah, quadruple-blind test, whatever, and that study confirmed what has been my life experience, that God just lets the natural world rule. I don't think petitionary prayer is a kind of spiritual technology, a means to get results. Rather, it's a way of relating to God, asking for good things, but sometimes he'll say no. But Jesus said he'll say yes. But suppose God answered all our prayers. Yankee fans would pray for them to win, Red Sox fans for the Sox to win. It's reasonable that God does not answer all our prayers. Yeah, right, I agree, that's reasonable, but Jesus says he does. Jesus says your prayers will be granted. He says, whatever you ask of me, I will do it for you. That's my point. Yes, but is he talking about what we think we want or what we really need? Hey, God, let me experiment with this drug. No, that's a bad example. Hey, God, my sister is sick, heal her. That's a good thing you're asking for. It's not selfish or crazy or bad for you. Yet all things that are really good for us, we will eventually get. It's just a matter of time. Oh, sophistry. I'm claiming sophistry. That's not what Jesus meant. Of course he meant that. No, he didn't. If he did, he would have said it differently. He would have said, things will be okay in the end. Not that you'll get what you pray for. If he meant it literally, he would have been an idiot, a fool. Well, he was an extremist. In my opinion, a religious extremist. Obviously you don't get everything you want. Well, then why did he say that? It's the same as the moving mountain passage. Has anyone ever performed the miracle of moving a mountain? No. So did he mean that literally? No. Yes. No. If he did, he's an idiot. He's a religious extremist. He's selling dreams to people. The average person is going to be wise enough to realize he's telling us to trust God. And only a few literalists are going to think that Jesus is giving us some supernatural technology. Okay, I'll pray and that mountain will move for me. That's stupid. Somebody says you can move this mountain, with enough faith. That's what he means. I think most people will interpret it that way, that with the right faith you can do miraculous things. Well, then most religious people are idiots. Oh, there you go. You said it. All right, I have another analogy. I'm the king of a country, and I have all my subjects in front of me, thousands of people, and I say to them, from now on I'm going to grant you your prayers. And they all cheer. But after the cheering dies down, I add, according to my will. Then they're just going to groan and maybe give me the finger and say, oh, this is the same old BS, nothing but rhetoric.
In that situation, yes, but when Jesus refers to what you want, he is implying God will give you what you most deeply want, what you really need, but don't know. St. Augustine's mother prayed for her son and didn't want him to go off away from home, but he did and became a great man. So her prayers were actually answered, what was best for him, despite what she thought at the time.
You had asked me about prayer. Do I pray? I generally don't, but if I want something very badly that's very important to me, I'll think it in my head for a quiet 3 or 4 seconds, kind of directed towards God. I figure that's all I have to do. God already knows what I want. I don't have to say Our Fathers and Hail Marys or get on my knees. There's no point in begging or beseeching.
Yeah, your method of prayer is not important. But another important point is that you can't get hung up on specifics, that you want this particular physical problem to get better, or your son to do well in the SATs. You can't dictate to God exactly what he ought to fix.
So what you want is a general good end result, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, I prayed for my sister's life, and that didn't help at all, so I don't do petitionary prayer. I don't think God intervenes that way.
I myself trust that God is running the universe in the best possible way, and the pain that people go through makes them stronger and wiser and better in the end, and it is hard to believe that.
Yeah, it is. Although I tend to agree with you there in general, that it's all part of a divine plan that comes out good in the end. On the other hand, I've heard an atheist say, yeah, right, I should beat up my wife every day so that she learns how to be strong. I thought that was a good point. That's not acceptable behavior for humans, so why is it for God? Certainly if we were God, we would run the universe more compassionately.
Yeah. C.S. Lewis has a very good essay about prayer. It's called A Question Without an Answer. See if I can find it. Yeah, here, you can borrow this.
Yeah, I'd like to read it. Here's my statement about prayer. I have no problem with meditational prayer, but I do not believe in the value of petitionary prayer, since I believe God does not answer such prayers. Results will be the same whether you pray to God or to a pumpkin. I heard that once. I think God, if he exists, lets the natural world run on its own, and things happen according to natural law and people's decisions. Ironically, I do agree with your eschatological, not scatological, that's eschatological, concept of petitionary prayer, that God does answer prayer in the end, which is what eschatological means, in the end.
Why is your theological position close to deism, where God doesn't interact with us?
Well, because I just don't see the evidence. I think he interacts in very, very subtle ways. Like, our bodies usually heal. Now, that's not a subtle fact, but my interpretation of that I think is subtle. I interpret that as God interacting with us, caring about us.
But you seem to be saying you have to have some proof. What about personal trust? Your parents never proved to you that if you step in front of a car you'll be killed. You trusted them. We do make all kinds of decisions based not on evidence but on faith or trust. You come into my office with faith that I'm not going to strangle you. You don't have proof of that, but you have enough trust not to worry about that.
Not yet, anyway. That reminds me of something that Christopher Hitchens said. He was doing a debate with a Christian, and the Christian is at the podium first and starts by saying, oh, I met Christopher earlier in the room over there, and he's a nice guy. I like Christopher. And then Hitchens intones from the sideline, the evening is young yet. Here's my latest statement on Jesus and prayer. You said that Jesus would have to be a fool if he intended his statement on granting prayers to be taken as literally true all the time. Granted, his statement must be interpreted through the lens of common sense and the normal expected understanding of his listeners.
Right.
Thus, there are qualifications. He did not mean that if you pray for the neighbor you hate to have a heart attack, that he will grant that prayer. He did not mean that if you pray to win the lottery, he'd grant that prayer. or that your favorite sports team will win, that he'd grant that prayer. He didn't mean that prayer is, as you termed it, technology to get you what you want. I agree with all that, okay? My point of disagreement is your claim that when Jesus said, whatever you ask, I will do it for you, that he meant in the end, eventually in heaven.
He means it eschatologically.
But he didn't say it that way. I think logically, if he meant in the end, he would have used some expression to indicate that.
God does not proceed on our timetable.
I found this passage in Matthew 18:19, where Jesus says, if two of you agree on earth, about anything they ask, it will be done for them. So to me, that indicates Jesus was not referring to just in the end, but to the time we're here on earth. On 60 Minutes this past week, they had a thing on people being gassed in Syria. About 1,000 people died. It was just horrible. They had video showing some of it, and a survivor was being interviewed, and he said people were screaming and panicking and choking to death, and he said praying to God to help them. I think that is exactly what Jesus was talking about, and God did not help 1,000 of those people.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. They died horribly. And at 9/11, the families and the people, when it was happening, were praying, and they didn't get helped.
They were praying for two things. One, be a piece of technology and get us out of this physical jam now. Number two, be the God that we can trust and bring us to heaven eventually and make us totally happy in the end. He always answers the second prayer. He often doesn't answer the first one. So which one of those two is more important?
Okay, and I agree with you there. That is a reasonable overall understanding of prayer. But my point is, that is not what Jesus was saying. He was promising more than just a good ending.
You said that we have to interpret his words in terms of what the listeners probably understood. Agreed. Now, do you really think that those who heard him interpreted that literally, that they'll get whatever they pray for in this world? If they did, they would have left him. The apostles wouldn't have hung around.
They knew he didn't mean everything.
Exactly.
But they also knew that what he did mean is that in the worst situation, help will be there. And it isn't. Those people in Syria died horribly.
But even Jesus' prayer to be spared from the cross was not answered. Even his petitionary prayer was not answered.
Right. So he was wrong in what he said about prayers being granted.
Prayer has a double layer. The technology part, in the Garden of Gethsemane, get me out of this, please. But then the qualification, not my will, but yours be done. That's the completed prayer. The second part is always done.
Okay, last point. C.S. Lewis's essay, Petitionary Prayer, A Problem Without a Solution. To me, the solution is petitionary prayer does not get answered beyond normal probabilities. That is the solution. Lewis talks about a father who promised his son anything he wanted for his birthday. He wanted a bike, but he gets a book. Now, he wasn't necessarily disappointed with the book, but he felt misled by his father because he had promised him anything he wanted. And Lewis asked, don't we have the right to feel likewise misled by Jesus' words?
No, not if he trusts that his father knows best, knows better what he needs. And it's inevitable that the mind of man and the mind of God are not always going to match. We can't see God's mind. We are not God.
Okay. All right, so those are my points. Most of them we agree to disagree. This has been very interesting and informative for me, and I greatly appreciate all the time you've taken with me.
There's a biblical expression for religious dialogue. Iron sharpens iron.
Ah, good one, yeah. Okay, thanks again.
Vivant, près de moi, guidance et m'enlace, chante et me sourit.